The slap cracked like thunder across first class. It was so sudden, so loud, that half the cabin dropped their champagne flutes. The man who got slapped didn't move at first. He just turned his head slowly, deliberately, like someone more stunned by the disrespect than the pain. His cheek was already red. His eyes, however, were clear, still, measured. The woman who slapped him, Bethany, a senior flight attendant in her late 30s, stood frozen, hands still hovering in midair, face flushing redder than his cheek. "You need to leave this cabin," she said, voice shaking now. "You don't belong here." The man blinked. Once. Then, calmly, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a slim black phone, and tapped the screen twice. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. He didn't call for the captain. He simply whispered, "Initiate freeze protocol. Flag flight star. Full sector scan." And just like that, a billion-dollar storm began to move through the skies. 6 hours earlier, Geneva, Switzerland. "Cancel the expansion," Richard Halberg said, not looking up from the folder in his hands. "They're over-leveraged and ethically questionable." His assistant, Larita, hesitated. "You're certain?" Richard glanced at her. "I don't lend money to people who lie to my face," he said evenly. She nodded. Noted. That was Richard Halberg, measured, relentless, and utterly unimpressed by shiny numbers. He wasn't the richest man in the world, not even close. But he was the one people feared in silence. Because he didn't destroy reputations, he froze them. He controlled $3.4 billion in credit lines for 9 major airlines through his firm, Halberg Capital. His name was rarely public, but within the industry, he was known as the Quiet Guillotine. When he pulled funding, operations collapsed within days. Now, he was headed home. 4 hours later, London Heathrow, Gate 42A. He didn't wear designer suits. He didn't arrive with bodyguards. He boarded like everyone else, just with more peace in his steps. Richard handed over his boarding pass, nodded politely, and entered the first-class cabin of Flight Star 401 to New York. Seat 1A, left window. He placed his slim black duffel overhead and settled into the seat, exhaling slowly. The plane smelled of leather, lavender, and power. He opened his leather-bound journal, writing 3 words before the interruption came. "Excuse me, sir." He looked up. Bethany stood over him, sharp bun, tighter smile. "This is the first-class cabin," she said. "I know," Richard replied gently. She scanned him, from the modest gray coat to the paper boarding pass in his lap. No Rolex, no Tom Ford, no Wall Street teeth. "I believe you've made a mistake," she said. "Coach is behind you." A few heads turned. Someone coughed awkwardly. Richard handed her his boarding pass without a word. Bethany barely glanced at it before muttering, "I'll verify this." She walked off in a clip of high heels in indignation. Moments later, Bethany returned, visibly irritated. "Well," she said, holding the pass with a reluctant hand, "it seems your ticket is valid." Richard gave her a patient nod. "Then we're settled." She wasn't. "There must have been an error," she muttered. "First class is for premium clientele, business leaders, celebrities, people who understand decorum." "Am I not being decorous?" Richard asked. "You're being," she began, then paused. "Difficult." Passengers around them were fully alert now. Some pulled phones, others whispered. The man in 1B glanced away. "I must ask you," Bethany said, voice rising, "to respect our standards. This is first." And that's when she snapped. The slap came out of nowhere. Fast, clean, and cruel. The cabin gasped. Richard didn't flinch. He took a breath, blinked slowly, and turned his face back to her. "I see," he said softly. Back to present time, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. Richard Halberg sat in silence. He wasn't angry. He wasn't hurt. He was processing the fact that this woman hadn't just insulted him. She had insulted the system that allowed her to thrive, a system that he had helped finance and build. He opened his phone. 2 secure messages went out. To COO, Halberg Capital. Flight star flagged. Suspend current tranche. Prepare full portfolio review. To Internal Compliance Director. Activate Halberg Standard review protocol across sector. High priority. Cross-check crew conduct files. He tucked the phone away. Then he calmly reopened his journal, wrote one word. Enough. 30 minutes later, across boardrooms in New York, Dallas, Frankfurt, and Toronto, red alerts began to appear on financial dashboards. $3.4 billion in active credit was under immediate review. Within hours, 4 crews across 3 airlines would be grounded pending investigation. Internal emails would leak. The press would pounce. And all of it started with a slap. A slap delivered to a man who didn't look like power, but who held the strings of the entire system. Bethany wouldn't learn until much later, too late, that she didn't just strike a man. She slapped the future of her own industry. And Richard Halberg? He wouldn't need to raise his voice. He never did. The plane had reached cruising altitude. The hum of the engines filled the space where moments earlier a slap had left the air cut sharp and still. First class had gone quiet again, but this time it was the awkward kind of silence. A charged one. No one dared look at Richard directly. No one dared speak to Bethany either. She had disappeared to the galley, leaving her colleagues to nervously shuffle drink carts and avoid eye contact. And Richard? He just sat in seat 1A, eyes fixed on the window, hands folded gently over a small leather notebook in his lap. Outside, the sky stretched open, calm, undisturbed. Inside, something had shifted, but he didn't look shaken. He looked still. Richard Halberg wasn't the type of man to make noise when he entered a room. He never had been. That's how he'd been raised. Born in Pittsburgh, the son of a postal clerk and a piano teacher, he grew up in a modest home on the edge of a steel town. His father taught him the value of keeping your word. His mother taught him the power of restraint. And the world? It taught him that no matter how smart you were, no matter how much you knew, there would always be someone, some gatekeeper, who'd decide, based on how you looked, whether you belonged. He remembered being 17, applying for his first business loan. Clean suit, sharp numbers, crystal clear pitch. The banker hadn't even looked at the application, just glanced at his shoes. "You're not our usual type," the man had said. Richard never forgot those words, or the slow burn of shame that came with them. But he didn't fight, he didn't yell, he worked. He studied economics by day and worked freight at night. Then he went to Wharton, quietly, graduated top 5%, launched Halberg Capital with just 3 clients and a desk in someone else's office. And then he built it, year by year, without fanfare, without headlines. Now, the man in seat 1A quietly oversaw $3.4 billion in revolving credit lines to the same types of airlines that used to ignore his calls. He never bragged. He never had to. Richard blinked slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of the notebook in his lap. He hadn't written a word since takeoff, just sat there, thinking. Not about the slap, not even about Bethany, but about the system that had allowed someone like her to rise, unchecked, unchallenged, empowered to humiliate with impunity. It wasn't personal. Not really. He'd seen worse. But there was something bitter about it this time. Maybe because he wasn't 30 anymore. Maybe because the world kept changing, faster, louder, more connected, and yet moments like this still happened, still hurt, still mattered. Across the aisle, a man in a navy suit shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes glancing toward Richard, then away. Twice, he opened his mouth like he wanted to say something. He didn't. Of course he didn't. They never did. People didn't speak up until they knew who you were, until they saw a name, until it cost them not to care. Richard had no name tag, no entourage, no media team. Just him, his notebook, and a mind that could reroute $500 million of liquidity with 2 taps on a screen. Bethany didn't know that. She saw an old man in a muted suit and a paper boarding pass. She saw someone who didn't belong, and that was her mistake. "Would you like a drink, sir?" a junior flight attendant whispered, appearing beside his seat like she was tiptoeing into a chapel. Richard turned toward her slowly, surprised someone had spoken to him. She looked barely 22, nervous, kind eyes. "I'm okay, thank you," he said gently. The girl hesitated. Then, quietly, she said, "I saw what happened. I'm sorry." He gave her a nod. "Not your fault," he replied. "But thank you." She moved on quickly, casting a glance toward the galley. Richard could see Bethany back there, arms folded, whispering sharply to a co-worker. Her shoulders were rigid, her jaw set. She was angry, no longer at him, but at what she'd done, and the fact that everyone had seen it. Richard turned back to his journal, and finally, he wrote, "Power is not in how loud you speak. Power is what still happens when you say nothing." He underlined the sentence once, slowly, then reached for his phone. The dashboard of Halberg Capital was more secure than most national banks. Richard opened the encrypted portal with a fingerprint scan and a passphrase that only made sense to him. He didn't check balances. He didn't review reports. He opened 2 files. Flightstar Airlines, Behavioral Audit Archive Sector-Wide Conduct Assessment. Crew-related incidents. Last 18 months. As the files loaded, he murmured to himself, "Let's see how deep this really goes." This wasn't about revenge. That wasn't his style. It was about accountability. Systems don't break from one slap. They rot over time, from the inside. Because no one ever looks, no one ever asks, and no one at the top ever says, "Stop, that's enough." Until now. Richard had decided he would say it, even if it cost them, even if it cost billions. Because if the people at the front of the plane could treat a stranger like this, on the assumption of status, what were they doing to those without the benefit of age, composure, or silence? He'd seen the pattern before, hidden in customer complaints, camouflaged as protocol, dismissed as misunderstanding. Now it was visible, tangible, personal. He tapped a memo to his COO. Initiate internal conduct review on Flightstar and affiliate carriers. Prioritize crew flagged for customer profiling or escalation incidents. Full reports by morning. Then he leaned back, not in anger, in purpose. The plane hummed. Passengers slept. The world moved on. But beneath it all, something was shifting. Bethany had no idea. No idea that the man she slapped would never raise his voice. He'd never tweet, never sue, never scream. He'd just rearrange the board underneath her, and the sound of that would be louder than any slap. The air in the cabin had shifted again, not from turbulence, but from tension. It was the kind that buzzed beneath polite smiles and forced eye contact, the kind that made you stir in your seat, unsure if you were witnessing something wrong, or just something you didn't understand yet. Richard sat quietly in 1A, his eyes not on the window this time, but on the reflection in it. From his angle, he could see the galley behind him. Bethany was back there, speaking in low tones to the senior purser, a man with graying temples and a visibly uncomfortable expression. He wasn't arguing, he was nodding. Richard had seen that nod before. The nod of someone who knew something wasn't okay, but had decided it wasn't their battle to fight. 10 minutes passed. Bethany emerged again, chin lifted, posture rigid, and began moving down the aisle. She didn't so much as glance at Richard this time. Instead, she stopped beside a middle-aged black woman seated in 2C. The woman, dressed in a soft blue cardigan and sensible shoes, looked up with a gentle smile. "Excuse me," the woman said kindly. Would it be possible to get a glass of water? Bethany didn't smile back, didn't acknowledge the tone or the warmth in the request. She gave a clipped nod. I'll get to it when I can, then walked past. The woman blinked, visibly surprised, but didn't press. Richard saw it. So did the man across the aisle, but no one said a word. 2 rows down, a white man in a suit, a regular-looking executive type, pressed his call button. Bethany practically appeared before the light finished blinking. "Yes, sir?" she said, smiling wide. "Could I trouble you for a second blanket?" he asked. "Oh, of course," she chirped. "Would you like one of the softer ones from business class? I can check." "That'd be great." Bethany returned in under a minute with 2 options, folded neatly, and even offered to fluff his pillow. The contrast was hard to miss. Richard didn't need a spreadsheet to spot trends. He'd built a billion-dollar firm by spotting patterns before other people even noticed they existed. And this wasn't random. Minutes later, another moment. An elderly black woman, perhaps mid-70s, stood slowly, struggling with the overhead bin. Her gray hair was pulled into a neat bun. She reached up with one hand, her other arm shaking slightly. "Excuse me," she said softly, looking around. "Would someone mind helping me?" Bethany, standing just a few feet away, glanced in her direction and then deliberately turned her back. She focused on reorganizing napkins in the service cart. Didn't say a word, didn't move. The elderly woman tried again, voice a little thinner now. "I just need a hand, please." That was enough. Richard stood. He didn't rush, he didn't sigh. He simply walked over, lifted the bag with a quiet grace, and placed it into the overhead compartment. "Thank you, young man," the woman whispered, embarrassed but grateful. "These old bones aren't what they used to be." Richard nodded gently. "It's no trouble, ma'am." He caught Bethany's eyes for a split second. Her jaw was clenched, her posture stiff. She looked embarrassed, but not because she had failed to help. She looked embarrassed because he had helped, because the man she had publicly shamed was now clearly watching her, and she didn't know who he was. Yet. Back in his seat, Richard opened his phone again. The Halberg sector scan was already populating. The AI system had pulled every documented passenger complaint from 9 airlines funded by Halberg Capital over the past 24 months. He filtered by crew conduct and keywords. Ignored, dismissed, rude, inappropriate language, profiling, attitude, elderly, race, escalation, double standard. The results were disturbing and telling. Bethany's name came up, more than once. One report read, "I asked for water twice and was told they were too busy." The same attendant brought champagne and warm towels to the couple next to me minutes later. "We were the only black family in first class." Another, "I was told I needed to move seats because someone else felt uncomfortable. When I asked why, no one could give me a reason. The attendant rolled her eyes. My daughter cried the rest of the flight." And then the one that sealed it. The flight attendant, Bethany W., made repeated passive-aggressive comments about my clothing and asked 3 times if I was sure I belonged in first class. I felt humiliated. I was on a business trip for my own company. Each report had been quietly closed. No action documented. Until now. Richard flagged the files and forwarded them to Halberg Capital's Director of Risk Ethics, marking the folder. Urgent. Conduct pattern. Financial risk attached. He then added a personal note. Recommend sector-wide review protocol. Consider conditional funding clauses tied to crew performance and documented behavior trends. Richard leaned back in his seat and stared at the ceiling. His heart was beating a little faster than usual. Not from anger, but from clarity. This wasn't about Bethany. It was about the culture that allowed her to thrive. The supervisors who looked the other way. The executives who buried complaints under bureaucracy and PR responses. If she was emboldened to slap a passenger and feel righteous doing it, what else had the system trained her to believe she could get away with? And how many other Bethanys were out there, only quieter, only subtler? Bethany returned to the cabin briefly, passing out meal trays with mechanical precision. She still didn't make eye contact with Richard. He didn't expect her to. She was still under the impression that she'd handled the situation, that she'd won, that her authority was intact. She had no idea. The plane hadn't even landed yet, and already the airline's compliance team had received 2 escalation notices from Halberg Capital's internal system. By the time they touched down, funding for the entire airline would be under formal suspension, pending a conduct review. 4 additional flight crews from partner airlines were being flagged for similar complaints. And the Halberg Standard, a proprietary behavioral compliance framework, was about to become the cost of doing business for any airline wanting continued access to capital. And still, Bethany passed by, chin high, ignoring the weight of the moment like it was turbulence she could wait out. Richard didn't look at her, didn't speak. He just took another note in his journal. She's not the story. She's the symptom. Richard didn't sleep. Not because he couldn't. He had long since trained his body to rest whenever, wherever. Over the years, jet lag had become background noise, like elevator music or turbulence. No, he stayed awake because something inside him refused to settle. Not rage, not pride. Something quieter, deeper, something that had been with him since boyhood. Outside the window, the Atlantic stretched like ink, smooth and endless. The stars above shimmered faintly, barely visible through the cabin glass. He could see his own reflection in the dark. An older man, weathered, thoughtful. The lines around his mouth deeper now than they were just a few years ago. Time had never scared him. What scared him was wasted time. And this flight, this moment, wasn't wasted. It had become a turning point. One he hadn't expected. He reached into the seat back pocket and pulled out the airline's glossy magazine. On the cover was an article titled, "The Future of Hospitality: How Airlines Are Building Trust at 30,000 Feet." He chuckled quietly, not out of mockery, out of irony, because he'd seen the future of hospitality tonight, and it had spat in his face and told him to go sit in coach. In seat 3D across the aisle, the older black woman he had helped earlier was sipping ginger ale slowly. She hadn't looked at him since he stood up to lift her bag. Not out of ingratitude, he knew that. Out of weariness. Out of that deep, unspoken feeling people like them carried. The cost of making other people uncomfortable. He knew it well. He remembered being her age. He remembered walking into boardrooms and watching people pause just a second too long before shaking his hand. Watching waiters serve him last. Watching security guards eye him in the lobby, even when his name was on the building. And through it all, he never made noise. He made moves. Richard opened his journal again and wrote just one sentence. "You can't audit dignity, but you can fund it." He sat with that line a moment. Then he opened a new file on his phone. Halberg Standard, Phase 2, Behavioral Credit Metrics. He wasn't just going to freeze money anymore. He was going to build a scorecard system. If you wanted his firm's capital, you'd need to earn it not just with numbers, but with how you treated people. Passengers, staff, everyone. And if your crew had a pattern of bias, if your leadership ignored patterns of discrimination, your money dried up. Simple. 30 rows behind him, Bethany moved quietly between aisles. She was calmer now, still avoiding him, still holding on to the illusion that this would blow over. Richard could almost hear her thoughts. He didn't scream. He didn't file a complaint. I was firm. I did my job. She didn't understand. She would. He opened the sector scan on his tablet again. The AI had now flagged 3 other airlines with behavior risk clusters, each linked to unresolved passenger complaints and customer satisfaction dips that correlated directly with crew ethnicity, seat class, and response time. He knew what this meant. He'd seen it in banks, too. Bias doesn't just hurt people, it hurts performance. It leaks into every KPI. It erodes trust, and eventually, it crashes reputations harder than any financial downturn. This wasn't just personal anymore. It was structural, and it was time to connect character to capital. Richard made one final note on the scan. Propose minimum dignity compliance threshold, DCT. Tiered interest model. In other words, the more inclusive and respectful your airline culture, the better loan terms you got. If not, you paid more or lost access entirely. The lights dimmed further. The cabin went into sleep mode, but Richard remained upright. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. He wasn't angry at Bethany. In truth, he felt something close to pity, because she'd been allowed to move through her career with just enough power to believe she was untouchable, but never enough wisdom to realize how exposed she really was. She was the product of a culture that rewarded surface control and punished introspection. She was, in many ways, trained to fail, and the system had let her. Until now. He remembered something his father once told him, back when Richard was 12 and had just been humiliated at a school debate by a teacher who accused him of getting help on his presentation because it was too polished. They'd walked home in silence, Richard blinking back tears, furious, ashamed. His father had stopped halfway down the block and said, "You can yell, and they'll hear you once, or you can outlive them, and they'll hear you forever." That night, Richard had stopped crying and started studying. He smiled faintly at the memory, and then closed the journal. It was enough reflection for one flight. At 3:14 a.m., EST, 37,000 feet above Newfoundland, Richard Halberg submitted the first official phase of the Dignity Metric credit algorithm to his firm's compliance lead and sector analytics team. Within minutes, 5 major airlines received silent alerts through the Halberg client portal. Credit review in progress. Update pending conduct evaluation metrics. The dominoes had begun to fall, and Richard didn't raise his voice once. One row behind, a man in a dark sweater leaned forward and said quietly, "Sir, excuse me, I just wanted to say thank you for earlier, helping that lady." Richard turned, slightly surprised. "You're welcome," he said simply. The man hesitated, then added, "She deserved better, and so did you." Richard gave a small nod. So did everyone on this plane, and soon, if things went the way he planned, they'd start getting it. The seatbelt sign had just turned off for landing prep when Richard Halberg finally reached for his phone. The hum of the engines dulled under the weight of what he was about to do. Not to those around him, but for them. Not to punish a single person, but to reset a standard that had been allowed to decay. He unlocked the screen, then tapped a contact not many people knew he kept. "Peter, Halberg Capital, Emergency Protocol." The phone didn't even ring twice. "Mr. Halberg," came the voice on the other end. Crisp, alert, no small talk. "We're clear to move?" Richard asked. "Yes, sir. The AI audit tagged conduct patterns across 4 primary carriers. We also received confirmation that Flightstar's onboard incident aligns with multiple unresolved complaints involving the same crew member. Do we proceed?" Richard didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed out the window, watching the coastline of the northeastern United States appear in the distance. City lights shimmered like constellations flipped upside down. "I want the freeze in place by the time we land," he said. "Full halt. Include all pending tranches, even the non-domestic ones." "Yes, sir." "And Peter," Richard added, voice calm but firm. "Cross-notify our lending partners. They need to understand this isn't about finance. It's about culture. Frame it accordingly." "I'll handle it." The call ended. Just like that. One conversation, no shouting, no threats, no press releases. And yet, by the time Flightstar 401 touched the tarmac, the financial lifeblood of an entire airline and 3 of its code-share partners had been shut off. As the wheels screeched softly against the runway, Richard looked around the cabin. Passengers were stirring awake, seatbacks upright, devices retrieved, smiles returning to tired faces as if nothing unusual had happened. Bethany walked through the aisle, smile rehearsed, voice cordial once more. She thanked people for flying. She offered wishes for a pleasant stay in New York, but Richard noticed her avoid row 1 entirely. She stopped at 2A, skipped him, and resumed at 3B. Small move. Telling one. She knew something had shifted, but not how much. Not yet. Inside Flightstar's headquarters, however, the ground had already begun to crack. An emergency alert flashed across the private dashboard of the airline's CFO. Priority 1. Credit flow suspended. Halberg capitalizing. Conduct review triggered status. Pending internal audit plus external compliance validation estimated freeze duration indefinite. The CFO froze mid-coffee sip. 3 seconds later, the CEO's phone buzzed. Then legal. Then investor relations. By the time Richard exited the jet bridge, 5 phones were already ringing in 5 different boardrooms. Meanwhile, Richard moved like he always did, quietly. He stepped into the terminal, nodding a polite thank you to the gate agent, who smiled without knowing she had just seen the most powerful person in the room walk by. He didn't need recognition. What he needed was results. 30 minutes after wheels down, Richard sat in the back of a black Lincoln town car headed toward his apartment in the Upper East Side. His phone buzzed. It was Sarah Jennings, his chief strategy officer at Halberg Capital. "I just got off the call with our board," she said. "They're all in." "Good," Richard said. "The freeze holds across all lines?" "All 9 carriers. Total freeze, $3.4 billion. He nodded. "They know it's coming from me?" he asked. "I didn't say your name," Sarah replied. "But they'll figure it out," he chuckled. "They always do." Back at Flightstar HQ, the situation had escalated. The CEO stood in a glass conference room surrounded by lawyers, PR reps, and risk analysts. On the screen was a copy of the complaint report from the flight Richard had just taken. Passenger names were redacted, but the crew names were not. Bethany's name appeared 6 times in the system over the past 18 months. Each entry was marked, "Closed, no action." That was no longer acceptable. The CEO leaned forward and said flatly, "We're not just dealing with one slap. We're dealing with a trend that's now tied to the survival of this company." Someone tried to push back. "Isn't this just a PR overreaction?" The CEO didn't even blink. "Halberg Capital doesn't do PR, they do patterns. If they pulled funding, it's because they found what we refused to see." The room went quiet. By the time Bethany clocked out and headed to her car in employee parking, she had no idea her name had just been flagged across 4 airlines as a liability. No idea that her conduct reports were being exported into risk dashboards. No idea that HR had scheduled an emergency meeting with her name on the subject line. And certainly no idea that Richard Halberg, the quiet man in seat 1A, was currently drafting an internal memo that would reshape how airlines tied crew behavior to financial privilege. In the Lincoln, Richard scrolled through emails. One caught his eye. An analyst at Halberg had finished a fast summary report. Impact projection, preliminary. Flightstar, 960 and pending funds frozen Atlas Air, 740 bound now in Global Sky, 1.1 B. Aero, Europa, 600 pound on them. Total suspended capital, 3.4 B. Risk flags. Origin, 67% tied to crew behavior. Attendant conduct, profiling, response bias. Recommendation, publicly announce new Halberg Standard in 48 hours. Richard tapped a reply. Too soon for public. Let it leak naturally. But internally, initiate pilot onboarding plan. Let's start from the inside, not the press. Later that evening, Richard sat by the window of his study, overlooking the city. He wasn't a man who smiled often, but tonight he did, just a little. Not because he had exacted revenge, but because he had done something few people in power ever get to do without ego. He had turned humiliation into reform, quietly, thoroughly, permanently. A single phone call had changed the trajectory of 5 airlines, not because of who he was, but because he knew exactly where the real pressure points were. Bethany had aimed her hand at a man she thought was beneath her. She didn't realize she had just slapped the banking system that let her airline fly. At 9:42 a.m., Flightstar's executive boardroom was packed, and no one was smiling. The CEO, Greg Tenley, stood near the whiteboard, arms crossed, jaw locked. In front of him, a half-dozen VPs scrolled rapidly through emails on their phones, reading and rereading the same line. Credit freeze in effect. All disbursements on hold. Compliance review pending. The air in the room felt like it was being vacuum sealed. No one wanted to say what they were all thinking. If Halberg Capital had pulled the plug, they were in real trouble. We need to get ahead of this, Greg said. Some kind of public-facing response. Proactive language. Greg, the CFO interrupted. This isn't a press problem, it's a liquidity problem. Greg shot him a look. No, it's a trust problem, he said. We lost Halberg's trust, and we don't even know why. Except they did. Because someone in legal had quietly pulled the latest complaint logs, and the name Bethany W. showed up 6 times. And someone in HR had confirmed she was working last night's flight from London. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. Meanwhile, in a much quieter building across the city, Richard Halberg stepped into the small conference room of his compliance team at Halberg Capital. No press, no fuss. Just a black coffee in hand and a plan in motion. Status update, he said. Sarah Jennings stood and handed him a printout. All 9 carriers have been formally notified. Compliance review protocols launched. 4 have responded within the hour. The others are stalling. Richard nodded, reading. Start flagging the ones who stall, he said. Slow cooperation is still a pattern. We've also had 2 partner banks reach out directly, Sarah added. They want to know what triggered the freeze. Tell them to check their HR records, Richard said. They'll find it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Back at Flightstar, damage control was already underway. Bethany was pulled into HR at 10:15 a.m. She walked in with a latte in one hand and confusion on her face. Wait, this is about that guy from 1A? No one answered directly. They just slid a folder across the desk. Inside, printed complaint logs, all with her name on them. Some dated back 2 years. Her face shifted, defensive, then confused, then angry. You think I caused a credit freeze? She scoffed. That guy didn't even complain. The head of HR, a tall woman named Melissa, replied flatly, he didn't need to. Bethany blinked. What's that supposed to mean? Melissa looked her straight in the eye. Bethany, that wasn't just a man in 1A. That was Richard Halberg. Silence. Pure, airless silence. Bethany's mouth opened, then shut. Her fingers twitched around the coffee cup. Richard, at that exact moment, was reviewing internal analytics. His new Halberg Standard pilot metrics were already pulling predictive behavior patterns from cross-referenced passenger complaints, social media data, and crew rotation logs. It wasn't just about Bethany anymore. It was about systems that allowed people like her to operate unchecked. He underlined one line in red ink. No culture audit equals no capital. That was the new rule. Not a suggestion, not a recommendation, a rule. By noon, 3 smaller airlines, Atlas Air, Blue Jet, and Aero Europa, had scheduled emergency board meetings. Their CFOs had received soft warnings. Unless they adopted Halberg's review system within 14 days, all capital would remain suspended indefinitely. That afternoon, Flightstar's CEO sent a formal letter requesting a private meeting with Halberg. No reply. Instead, Richard sent his legal team to draft a universal compliance clause. By 4:00 p.m., the terms were clear. Airlines receiving Halberg Capital funding must adopt the dignity compliance metric, must implement annual crew culture training, must respond to customer complaints within 48 hours, must publish annual behavior audits to retain capital flow. Failure to comply equals automatic loss of credit eligibility. And still, Richard didn't speak publicly. Not one press conference, not one tweet. He didn't need attention. He needed transformation. At 5:12 p.m., a news outlet finally broke the story. $3.4 billion suspended. Quiet billionaire ties airline capital to human dignity. It exploded. Within hours, #Halberg Standard trended worldwide. Aviation forums lit up. Industry CEOs were blindsided. Passenger advocacy groups hailed the move as historic. And Bethany? She was placed on indefinite leave. No announcement, no fanfare, just quietly removed. That evening, Richard sat in his townhouse study with a worn journal open on his lap. He scribbled a thought. They call it cancel culture when a powerful man uses his voice. But what do they call it when a silent man uses his silence? He didn't know, but he knew this. Every airline that wanted to survive tomorrow had to reckon with today. And not because of headlines, but because the money had stopped moving. If you were in Richard's shoes, would you have made the call or walked away? Let us know in the comments. Your thoughts matter more than ever. The first sign of real panic didn't come from Flightstar. It came from their competitor. At exactly 9:03 a.m. the next morning, a press release from Aero Europa, one of the mid-tier transatlantic carriers, hit the wires. We are fully committed to dignity-driven service. Effective immediately, we will begin implementation of the Halberg Standard across all operations. No one saw it coming. Not the analysts, not the other airlines, and certainly not Flightstar, who had spent the last 12 hours frantically trying to figure out how to reach Richard Halberg without appearing desperate. The reaction was swift and brutal. Flightstar's stock dipped 4% before the markets even opened. By noon, it was 7.5%. Inside Halberg Capital's 19th floor boardroom, Richard didn't say much. He didn't need to. The numbers were speaking loud enough. Across the screen in front of him, a real-time dashboard showed market behavior tied to every airline in their lending portfolio. Lines dipped, funds paused, risk scores updated by the second. He sipped his tea slowly. No sugar, no milk. Just as he had for the past 40 years. Sarah, his CSO, stood beside the monitor. Global Sky's team just requested an early negotiation window for next quarter, she said. They want to get ahead of the dignity metric rollout. Richard looked up. They called us? He asked. Sarah nodded. 2 hours ago, before the Aero Europa release. He gave a slow nod. Then let's meet, he said. If they're smart enough to knock, we're smart enough to answer. By lunchtime, the phrase Halberg Standard was trending on aviation news sites across 3 continents. But not everyone was on board. Inside Flightstar's executive suite, the mood was grim. Their public relations chief, Lyle, paced back and forth while the CEO sat at the head of the table, staring at the live broadcast from Bloomberg. The anchor was mid-sentence. Seen as a wake-up call for an industry long criticized for customer profiling and inconsistent service. What's unique here is that Halberg isn't pushing regulation. He's simply pulling money. And it's working. Turn it off, the CEO muttered. A young aide did, fumbling with the remote. Lyle paused. We need to get ahead of this or we're going to look like we're resisting change. The CEO snapped. We're not resisting, we're reviewing. Sir, Lyle said carefully, that is resistance. Back in his office, Richard opened an email from his compliance team. Preliminary compliance interest from 5 out of 9 major partners. 2 carriers have formally requested template metrics. 1, Flightstar, has yet to respond beyond automated receipt. He closed the laptop, walked to the window, looked out at the skyline. Not with arrogance, but with a kind of quiet calculation. He never wanted to be famous. He never cared for legacy. But moments like this, they defined what power meant. Not because he had used his wealth to crush someone, but because he had used it to shift the axis of an entire industry without ever giving an interview. In a hangar-turned training center outside Chicago, a Flight Star internal memo had just gone live. Effective immediately, all crew are required to complete Phase 1 of the Dignity Training Module. Attendance is mandatory. Bethany read the email on her phone in stunned silence. She was sitting alone in her car, engine off, hands trembling slightly. Yesterday, she had been pulled aside and told she was on leave. Today, she was being offered a choice: enter training and return, or resign. She hadn't responded yet. She wasn't sure if she even could. How do you return to work when you've become the case study? Meanwhile, public reaction was growing. One video blog, normally focused on airline points and travel hacks, uploaded a new episode titled "The Billionaire Who Grounded an Industry and Never Raised His Voice." It got 2 million views in 24 hours. Passengers began sharing stories, some familiar, some horrifying, many subtle. A woman posted, "I once flew first class with my elderly father. He's black. The attendant asked me for ID to confirm I had paid. Never looked at him, just skipped him. Now I wonder, what if someone like Richard had been watching?" A retired teacher wrote. Halberg didn't cancel anyone. He didn't call the news. He just said, "You don't get money if you disrespect people. That's not vengeance. That's leadership." And beneath those comments, thousands more followed. Richard read a few that night. Only a few. Enough to remind him that what he was doing mattered. That his silence, his stillness, hadn't gone unnoticed. And then, like always, he closed the laptop and opened his journal. It was never about the seat. It was never about the slap. It was about a system that believed kindness was optional and that cruelty had no cost. And still, he didn't gloat. He didn't post. He didn't speak to the media. Because the moment you make it about yourself, you shrink the size of the message. Back at Flight Star, the CEO finally agreed to meet with Richard's team. But he didn't meet Richard, because Richard never showed up. Instead, he sent a junior associate, and with her, a single sheet of paper. The updated terms of funding, the new conditions, the behavioral thresholds, and, at the bottom of the page, one line handwritten in perfect cursive. "There are no shortcuts to dignity, only consequences for delay, RH." The CEO didn't say a word, just stared at the paper, and for the first time in his 22-year career, he felt something he hadn't felt from a banker before: accountability. When Bethany stepped through the glass doors of the Flight Star Training and Ethics Center, something inside her shifted. It was the first time she had returned to company grounds since the incident. No uniform, no badge, no sense of control. She felt like a ghost wandering through her own past. The receptionist greeted her with a neutral smile, handed her a visitor's pass, and directed her to room 4B, a modest conference room with tinted windows, 6 chairs, and a large flat screen mounted on the wall that quietly displayed Dignity and Inclusion Workshop, Session 1. Bethany sat down in the corner, alone. She was 15 minutes early. Old habit. People began trickling in. A mix of staff, 2 flight attendants she didn't recognize, a gate agent from Newark, and an older male pilot who looked like he didn't want to be there. Nobody made eye contact with her. No one whispered, but she could feel it in the air. They knew. She was the one. The one who slapped a passenger in first class. The one who triggered the freeze. The one who now stood as the warning label of the Halberg Standard. The facilitator entered next. A black woman in her early 50s, silver streak in her hair, eyes soft but sharp. Her name tag read, Nina Jacobs, Training Lead, Halberg Cultural Integrity Unit. Yes, Halberg. The system wasn't just a policy anymore. It had people, and they were watching. "Good morning," Nina began warmly. "I want to start today by saying something simple. You're not here to be punished. You're here to understand." Somebody scoffed quietly. The pilot, probably. But Nina didn't flinch. She let the silence sit. "We'll be reviewing actual incidents," she continued. "Some of them might feel uncomfortably familiar. That's the point." Bethany's stomach turned. The first video clip played. A reenactment based on a real complaint. A flight attendant ignoring a woman of color who asked for water, but responding immediately to a white male passenger with the same request. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overt. That's what made it sting more. Bethany remembered doing the exact same thing, not once, maybe not even on purpose, but enough. She didn't look away. She couldn't. Later in the session, Nina asked everyone to write down one moment when you may have made someone feel invisible. Bethany stared at the blank page in front of her. At first, her mind rejected it. I was just doing my job. I never meant harm. I was following protocol. Then she remembered the little girl with the stuffed penguin, how she'd ignored the child's tears when her mother politely asked for help. She remembered the older man who tried to explain his seat assignment and how she'd assumed it was fake. She remembered Richard, how calm he had been, how she'd slapped him, thinking she was protecting the standard of service, only to find out he was the one funding it. She wrote one sentence. "I didn't see him, but he saw everything." After the session, Nina approached her. "Bethany, can I walk you out?" They exited into the corridor quietly. "You stayed present the whole time," Nina said gently. Bethany nodded. "It was hard," she whispered. "Hard to see myself like that, on the other side." "That's the beginning of growth," Nina replied. "Seeing yourself not just as the victim of misunderstanding, but as someone who misunderstood the power they held." Bethany's throat tightened. She wasn't used to anyone speaking to her like that, not with softness and accountability in the same breath. "Am I even allowed to come back?" she asked. "To the skies?" Nina tilted her head. "Do you want to come back?" Bethany paused. She wasn't sure how to answer. Across town, in Halberg Capital's operations center, Richard sat in a quiet meeting with his internal ethics team. They had reviewed Bethany's training performance. "She's engaged," Sarah said. "No defensiveness, no performative remorse, real discomfort, real effort." Richard didn't react. He was watching the live feed from a crew onboarding session at Global Sky Airlines, their first Halberg certified training launch. The instructor's voice crackled through the speakers. "Power doesn't always look like money. Sometimes it looks like the ability to ruin someone's day, or save it, with a single sentence." Richard closed his eyes. They were getting it, finally. Back at her apartment, Bethany sat on her small couch, flipping through her old flight manual. She used to know every page by heart. Now, each section felt different. Not because the rules had changed, but because she had. The difference wasn't in the policies, it was in the lens. The next morning, she received a letter from Flightstar HR. Her record would remain flagged, but she would be allowed to apply for a reinstated crew position, not immediately, but pending completion of 6 full training modules and approval by a mixed panel review team. No promises, no guarantees, just a door, one she could earn her way back through, if she was willing to work for it. In a surprising twist, her phone buzzed later that evening. It was a message from someone she didn't expect. From Richard H. "I believe redemption isn't given, it's chosen, and chosen again. Keep choosing it." Bethany sat frozen for several moments. No signature, no threat, no conditions. Just a man she had once humiliated, now reminding her what grace looked like. 2 weeks later, Flightstar launched its first Halberg-endorsed Ambassador crew, a team of 10 veteran flight staff trained to lead the new culture initiative across all hubs. Bethany wasn't on it. Not yet. But she showed up. Every morning, sat in the back of every seminar, took notes like a rookie. And when passengers started to notice real change, it wasn't just because of Richard Halberg. It was because people like Bethany finally understood who they were becoming. It started with a cup of water. Simple, forgettable even. But to Mrs. Teresa Holloway, a retired school teacher flying alone for the first time in over a decade, it meant the world. She had barely settled into her seat in 4A when the flight attendant knelt beside her, not hovered above, not barked instructions, but knelt, gently asking, "Would you like some water while we're still on the ground, ma'am?" Mrs. Holloway blinked. "Oh well. Sure, if it's not too much trouble." The young man smiled. "It's never trouble. You're our guest." When he walked away, she sat still for a long moment, hands in her lap, eyes moist. No one had ever said that to her on a plane before. A few rows back, a mother traveling with her 2 mixed-race children noticed something else. When she struggled to juggle her toddler's backpack, snack bag, and the stroller gate check tag, a uniformed crew member stepped in, smiling. "Here, let me carry that for you. We've got you." No judgment, no sighs, no sideways glances. Just help. Real, human help. Flight Star's cabin atmosphere was shifting, and not in grand, theatrical ways, but in thousands of quiet moments. Moments that were once ignored, dismissed, or rushed. Moments that now made people feel seen. Inside the airline's New York Training Center, Nina Jacobs reviewed her team's weekly progress report. 94% completion rate of Phase 1 Halberg Standard training, 11 internal conduct reviews reopened voluntarily, 3 promotions delayed pending crew coaching, 1 disciplinary hearing reversed after mediation request. It was working. Not just because staff feared punishment, but because people were starting to care about how they showed up, about how they were perceived, about who they were becoming. Richard Halberg didn't need spreadsheets to know change was taking root. He saw it in the letters. They came in waves now, printed, typed, even handwritten. Some were from passengers, others from staff. Some came from the very people who once resisted the change. One in particular stood out. It was from a senior gate agent in Atlanta. "I used to assume the loudest passengers were the problem. Now I check if we're the ones who forgot to listen first. Thank you for reminding us that dignity isn't optional. It's the cost of entry." Richard kept that one on his desk, not because it flattered him, but because it told the truth. Back in the skies, the Halberg Standard wasn't just policy anymore. It had become reputation. Passengers began posting on social media, not complaints, but compliments. Flight Star crew actually offered to help me before I had to ask. "Never happened before. Is this real?" My mom cried. First time anyone helped her lift her carry-on without acting like it was a favor. "Something's changing. Feels different. In a good way." On a quiet Thursday morning flight from Boston to Dallas, Bethany took her seat in the jump seat for the first time in 42 days. No one made an announcement about her return. No spotlight, just another crew member. But those who knew, knew. And they watched her. She noticed every glance, every pause in a conversation, but she didn't flinch, didn't posture. Instead, she went row by row, offering assistance, adjusting blankets, greeting passengers like old friends. She wasn't pretending. She had earned her return, not with apologies, but with action. And that day, when a young black girl hesitated before asking for a juice refill, Bethany knelt beside her and said, "You don't have to ask small, sweetheart. Ask proud." The mother's eyes filled. She mouthed a silent, "Thank you." Bethany just smiled. In Halberg's midweek operations meeting, Sarah presented the latest compliance dashboard. Global Sky adopted full behavioral review audit. Aero Europa expanded Halberg Standard to hiring pipeline Blue Jet integrated passenger feedback loops in real time. Flight Star submitted full Year 1 compliance model, certified by third party. Richard sat back in his chair, said nothing for a while. Then, "What about the complaints?" "Down 38% overall," Sarah said. "Bias flagged reports down 54%. Repeat offender patterns? Mostly gone." He nodded. "Good," he said. "Now let's make sure it sticks." That evening, a Flight Star executive sent an internal message to all staff. "For decades, we taught service like it was a script. Now we're teaching it like it's a conversation." The Halberg Standard isn't a requirement. It's a reminder that people deserve more than transportation. They deserve respect. Meanwhile, Bethany stood in the galley, watching the sun rise through the small oval window in the crew door. It had been a long flight, but a good one. She sipped lukewarm coffee and felt something she hadn't in months: peace. Not because the past had been erased, but because she was finally becoming someone new, someone aware, someone responsible, someone who understood that every seat on a plane carried more than a passenger. It carried a story. And now, she had learned how to honor that. The cabin was bright with morning sun as Flight Star 218 cruised smoothly over Colorado airspace. Bethany moved down the aisle with practiced calm. It had been 3 weeks since she returned to full duty, and most flights had gone without incident. Passengers were warmer. Her colleagues, less tense. It felt different, better, until she reached seat 2C. The man there didn't look up, just held out his hand, 2 fingers tapping against the empty champagne flute beside him. Bethany smiled gently. "Would you like a refill, sir?" The man didn't smile back. He was mid-60s, silver hair, expensive blazer, gold cufflinks. The type who saw service not as a courtesy, but as an entitlement. He tapped the glass again. Harder. Bethany took a breath, unbothered. "I'll bring that right over," she said. "We're finishing service in row 1, but I'll return in just a minute." That's when he spoke. Low, sharp. "This is first class, sweetheart. You served me before anyone else. I paid for that." Bethany froze. Not outwardly, but something curled inside her. She smiled, small, steady, and nodded. "Of course, sir. Thank you for your patience." She walked back to the galley slowly, her fingers clenched just tight enough not to shake. It wasn't the rudeness that rattled her. It was the familiarity of it. The way he looked through her, not at her. The way his tone assumed power. The way he clearly believed that price buys priority, and people like her came with the seat. She had once been on the other side of that dynamic. Now, she was trying to fix it. And here it was, testing her. In the back galley, Bethany's crew partner, Angela, glanced at her. "You okay?" Bethany nodded once. "Yeah, just one of those passengers." Angela raised a brow. "Which kind?" Bethany hesitated, then answered quietly, "The kind that doesn't think change applies to them." She brought the champagne, set it down gently. "Thank you for waiting, sir." The man scoffed. "Took long enough. This Halberg nonsense got you people thinking manners are a substitute for speed." Bethany blinked. So that's what this was. A man used to controlling the rules, now chafing under new ones. A few minutes later, while distributing hot towels, Bethany heard him mutter to the woman next to him. "Ever since that billionaire pulled his stunt, this whole crew's been acting like therapists instead of flight staff. Just do the job." The woman didn't respond, just looked out the window. Bethany said nothing, but inside she felt the weight of it. The Halberg Standard had changed policy, training, even public image, but it hadn't yet changed entitlement. And this man, he was proof. After landing, as passengers gathered their bags, the man approached her at the exit. He didn't smile, didn't thank her, just leaned in and said, "You're lucky someone like me still bothers flying your airline. Don't push that luck." Then he was gone. Later that afternoon, Bethany sat alone in the crew lounge, her hands wrapped around a vending machine coffee, cold by the time she touched it. She kept replaying the moment, not because she wanted to react, but because she wanted to know. Had she done the right thing? Had she truly lived the standard she now represented? That's when her supervisor, Marcus, walked in. He sat across from her, said nothing for a while, then pulled out his tablet and turned the screen toward her. It was a passenger survey submission. From 2D, the woman who had sat beside the man. Bethany read it slowly. "I watched your crew handle a very entitled and inappropriate man today. I was afraid she'd snap. I would have, but she didn't. She stayed calm, professional, but firm. This is what change looks like when it holds. Quiet strength, not submission. Bethany's eyes welled. She hadn't cried through training, not through HR, not even when Richard Halberg had messaged her. But now, she allowed it, just for a moment. Marcus handed her a tissue and said quietly, "This is why we backed you. Not because you were perfect, because you were ready." That night, in his townhouse library, Richard Halberg sat reading a report from Flightstar's culture liaison. The subject line read, "First-class incident, passenger resistance to new norms." Richard read the brief summary, saw Bethany's name, saw the quote from the passenger in 2D. He smiled faintly, then underlined one sentence in the report. "Crew member demonstrated full behavioral alignment under provocation. De-escalation achieved without concession." Richard closed the file, then opened his journal and wrote, "The real test isn't policy, it's poise." The next day, Flightstar announced a new initiative. They called it Altitude Integrity, a peer-nominated recognition program for staff who upheld the Halberg Standard under real pressure. The first recipient? Bethany. Not for training completion, not for public apology, but for quiet grace in the face of outdated arrogance. The announcement was internal. No press, no email blasts. Just a notice in the crew app, with her name and a one-line commendation. For remembering that dignity is most visible when others try to erase it. The call came on a Tuesday, not from a journalist, not from a CEO, but from a private equity firm in Zurich, well-dressed, well-mannered, and well-funded. Richard Halberg didn't answer right away. He let the voicemail play out as he stood by his window overlooking a rainy Manhattan skyline. "Mr. Halberg, we admire your vision. The Halberg Standard has become a disruptive force. We'd like to discuss acquiring the IP, scaling it globally, and, if you're open, buying you out." He didn't blink, just turned the volume down. By that point, 8 airlines had fully adopted the Halberg Standard. 3 others were negotiating early compliance just to stay competitive, and the media had pivoted. They no longer called it Halberg's Revenge. They called it the quiet revolution in the skies. Business schools were writing case studies. Passenger trust metrics had skyrocketed. Recruiting interest from younger, more diverse applicants was the highest Flightstar had ever recorded. And yet, here came Zurich, with its suits and strategy decks, trying to turn dignity into a line item. Sarah Jennings, Richard's longtime CSO, didn't hide her reaction. "They want to white label it," she said. "Halberg Standard Inc. licensing model, onboarding toolkits, speaking tours, you as the face of the brand." Richard raised an eyebrow. "I didn't build this to go on a shelf," he said. "They're offering $480 million, she replied flatly. Still, he didn't react. Sarah sighed. "They don't understand. This isn't tech, it's culture. You don't install dignity like software." That evening, Richard sat alone in his study, fireplace low, journal open, rain tapping against the windows. He reread an email from a first-year flight attendant at BlueJet. "The first time a black passenger called me ma'am, I almost cried. I realized I had never felt truly respected at work before. Not until now. Thank you for giving us something real to carry." He closed the email. Then his eyes drifted to the Zurich proposal again. A 64-page deck, metrics, markets, projections. All correct, all bloodless. They saw the standard as a product, but to him, it was a principle. The next day, he flew commercial for the first time since the incident. Not first class, not even business. Economy, middle seat, middle row. No announcement, no perks. Just people. He watched the crew interact. Watched the way a young attendant helped an elderly man with his bag without being asked. Watched the way another offered a blanket to a crying baby's mother and said, "Take your time, we've all been there." He smiled. They didn't know who he was, and that was the point. When he landed, there was another email waiting. From Flightstar's board this time. Not a demand, a request. We'd like to formally endorse the Halberg Standard as industry best practice, not just for optics, for ethics. Will you help us design the next phase? Richard tapped the screen once, replied, "Yes, but it stays free. Dignity doesn't come with a price tag, RH." Later that night, he finally called Zurich back. The man on the line was warm, polished. "Mr. Halberg, thank you for your time. I hope you've reviewed the valuation and..." Richard cut in gently. "I have, and I appreciate it. But the answer is no." A long pause. "May I ask why?" Richard looked out at the city, then answered softly, "Because what I built wasn't meant to scale. It was meant to restore. To remind people that you don't need to be loud to be powerful. You just need to stand still long enough for others to feel the weight of your silence." The room was quiet, not out of fear, out of respect. It was a sleek, wood-paneled conference hall at Flightstar's corporate headquarters, packed with board members, senior executives, HR directors, and crew representatives from every regional hub. At the front stood a single microphone, and beside it, Bethany. No uniform today, just a plain navy blouse, black trousers, and a small silver pin on her collar, the Halberg Standard emblem, a circle enclosing an open eye, the symbol of watching, of noticing, of no longer pretending not to see. Richard sat near the back, not because he was hiding, but because he wasn't the story anymore. Today wasn't about power or silence or the financial dominoes he had set in motion months earlier. Today was about something far rarer: redemption. Bethany took a deep breath, stepped toward the microphone. Her voice didn't shake. "6 months ago, I made a choice on a flight that changed my life. I thought I was enforcing professionalism, but what I was really doing was policing who I thought deserved dignity." The room didn't move. No cameras, no sound crew, just people, listening. "I believed, deep down, that first class was a reward for a certain kind of passenger, a certain look, a certain tone, and I punished those who didn't fit that mold. Not with violence every time, but with something worse, with dismissal, with coldness, with silence." She paused. "Until one day, someone finally saw me. Not just my mistake, but my pattern. And instead of shouting, he made one call, and suddenly, the whole world listened." No one looked at Richard, but everyone felt him. Bethany continued, "What I did was wrong. What the system allowed me to do was worse. And what Mr. Halberg taught us was that we can't fix culture by asking the people hurt by it to stay quiet. We have to change what we tolerate, what we teach, what we fund." A soft murmur of agreement moved through the room. She smiled gently. "This isn't about me getting my job back. It's about us, not forgetting how we lost sight of people in the first place." From the back of the room, Richard leaned forward just slightly in his chair. A younger executive beside him whispered, "Do you think she's ready?" He didn't answer. He just smiled. Later that afternoon, Flightstar's CEO took the stage. He cleared his throat, spoke plainly. "As of today, the Halberg Standard is no longer a pilot initiative. It's the foundation of who we are. Every new hire, every internal promotion, every partner we work with will be measured by this framework, not just for compliance, for character." He turned toward Bethany, then toward Richard. "We're not just building better service. We're building better people." That night, Richard walked alone through Central Park. The city hummed softly in the distance. He stopped near a small bench beneath a maple tree and sat down, watching the leaves shift in the wind. His phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "Zurich backed off. No more offers. They say you've created something too ethical to monetize." He chuckled quietly, then typed back, "Good. Maybe they'll build something human next time." The next morning, a new crew class began training in Houston. Their facilitator was Nina Jacobs. She stood beside a whiteboard with the words, What does dignity feel like? One by one, the trainees answered. Like being seen. Like not needing to prove I belong. Like knowing you matter, even when no one's watching. In the back row, Bethany sat quietly, observing, taking notes. Not to teach, but to make sure the next wave didn't start where she did. That evening, a passenger on a short-haul flight from Minneapolis to Chicago posted on social media. Just flew with a crew that treated my immigrant mother like a queen, offered water in her native language, gently helped her with her cane, never once looked impatient. She cried after we landed. You can't fake that. You can only become that. At home, Richard closed his journal for the last time. No speech, no press tour, no memoir. He had done what he came to do, with just one call, one freeze, one standard, and a message that would outlive him. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes, it's the sound of justice landing softly. Have you ever witnessed quiet dignity shift an entire situation? Without yelling, without drama, just truth. We'd love to hear your story in the comments, because sometimes the loudest change is the one nobody saw coming, but everybody felt.